Okay, so let's see what's on the news.
Video game makers and their critics at the White House.
Bad things are happening to young kids and young minds.
Okay, pause. Let's get to the bottom of this. By now you should know that American news organizations love to talk about the effects of violent video games following a major tragedy like a school shooting. A lot of responsibility is thrown on the developers for making such games and having these games accessible to children, because we've all seen kids scream about Fortnite, Five Nights at Freddy's, or whatever the latest trend to come up is. It's only logical that we have to protect our youth, and if video games may have horrible consequences, it forces us to ask the question, is there a responsibility on the developers of violent video games to limit access to children in order to mitigate the influence it may or may not have on them? So I've looked into the topic for a little bit, and it seems incredibly clear what the answer is. Producers should not have to restrict access to their games because of a few key points: parental responsibility, freedom of speech, and a lack of supporting evidence. Okay, so let's get into this. This is probably the most straightforward way of thinking about this problem. Some parents will take their kids to see R-rated movies and others will not. Just like movies, parents have the choice to choose whether or not they buy their children violent games. In the US, selling video games follows a very similar system to watching movies. Games get ratings based on their content, and games that are deemed mature or up are only purchasable by adults. So it only seems logical that parents are given the right to choose what media their children consume. It only seems fair that parents' right to choose applies to video games as well. I'm not a parent myself, so it's hard for me to sit here and lecture you on this, so let's take some advice from some more qualified people. According to Kotaku, a Gallup poll reported that 86% of parents who participated in the survey felt that parents should have a large responsibility in controlling what their children can and cannot consume. Logically, parents should be the best judge of what's a good or bad parent. And when you have so many parents agreeing on the same topic at such an alarming percentage, it only makes sense that this would be a fair statement. If you're worried about that maybe sales won't be stopped, an article in the Missourian reported that over 90% of underage attempts to buy violent video games were stopped, which is really high in a digitized world. Now, I'm sure some of you still aren't convinced. Sure, it may be the parent's choice, but sometimes parents make bad decisions. As Americans, we value our freedom of speech a ton. Other sources of media like television shows, literature, and even the news are just as gory and potentially damaging to children. Yet none of these have the same restrictions that many want to impose on video games. If we have these free speech limitations for video games, I don't see a reason why these restrictions are not being pushed for other sources of media. If you think that there is a case there, well, the Supreme Court has weighed in as well. In a case of California versus the Merchants Association, the Supreme Court struck down a law that California was attempting to impose that tried to pass further restrictions on the sale of violent video games, requiring further specifications on labels, making it more difficult to purchase games without parents. The Supreme Court ruled fully on the grounds of the First Amendment, and former Justice Scalia said, like the protected books, plays, and movies that preceded them, video games communicate ideas, and even social messages, through many familiar literary devices such as characters, dialogue, plot, and music, and through such features distinctive to the medium, such as the player's interaction with the virtual world, that suffices to confer with First Amendment protection. Okay, so now that you know there isn't a grounds on the basis of free speech, we can focus on one of the biggest, if not biggest, point to make in this entire debate. There have been extensive papers and research studies done on the subject of the violence caused by video games, and many studies and experts in the field have come to the conclusion that these types of games do not have any major impact on children. Some, like Eric Kane, say that results of meta-studies show that most studies of violent video games over the years suffer from publication biases that tilted the results of the studies towards foregone correlative conclusions. What Kane is trying to say is that many studies on studies that have found research on video games being violent have shown that studies on video game violence have been blatantly biased and just make claims based on correlation rather than statistical causation. Markley and Ferguson agree with this point, as they say not only researchers guilty of overgeneralization and extrapolation of these findings from such studies, but they sometimes get sloppy with how they conduct these experiments in the first place. They go on to elaborate that many video game meta-studies that have found research done in the field is extremely poor from a qualitative perspective. These two articles point out a large portion of studies seem to be largely inaccurate because it's near impossible to generate a sample size large enough to draw a statistically reasonable conclusion. That's a lot of information to take in, and I get it, but it's not really the most important of all of it. The only organization that's been continuously claiming that there's merit in the idea that video games cause violence is the American Physicians Association. But according to multiple reviews of the publication in the U.S. National Library of Medicine and the National Institute of Health search database, it seems to be largely biased because of how infeasible such a study is. To quote a review originally posted in the Psychological Bulletin, moderator analysis revealed significant research design effects, weak evidence of cultural differences in susceptibility and type measurements effect, and no evidence of sex differences in susceptibility. Results of various sensitivity analysis revealed these effects to be robust with little evidence of selection or publication bias. So, okay, with so much research unable to draw clear lines between video game violence and violent tendencies in children, is there even a basis to ban video games on? Yes, it's a nice and clean narrative and to go and say, hey, that thing that kids are playing is violent, and I'm not noticing that kids are becoming more violent. So it must be that thing's fault. But is it really fair to start banning a game with no proof whatsoever that there is a problem with it and punishing developers of those games? So at this point, you've heard my fill on the topic. Video games should be left up to parents' discretion because they're the ones responsible for their children. Video games are protected by the First Amendment, and then finally, there is a lack of a clear link between video games and violence in the first place. So with all that being said, we can conclude that developers shouldn't have to censor their games in order to protect children. With all that being said, we can conclude that developers shouldn't have to censor their games to protect children. But why does it matter? It matters because developers have to deal with people saying otherwise, and it hurts our ability to produce more games that we love. So, what are we even going to do about this? Well, one of the more involved things you can do is support organizations against censorship and supporting freedom of speech. One of the big ones that you might want to check out is the NCAC, or the National Coalition Against Censorship. Then, if you really feel determined to make an impact, you can find out about your local representatives' views on the subject and give them a call. Okay, so a few of you are saying that this is way too much work, and you don't want to do that. Okay, fine. I'll leave you on one final way you can make a difference that can change the world. Support developers and buy games. Thank you.